Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dan, the voice behind ThatKaitoDan, and holy hell, I've been animated! Thanks Amphipop! Anyway, welcome at last to my full review for RWBY Volume 3. We're now on the long road towards Volume 4, but until then, it's time that I share my overall feelings on this massive volume. However, let me start by saying, spoiler warning. Please do not watch if you don't want to be spoiled on the volume's events. Also, please remember that these are just my opinions, and I do share them with the show's best interests at heart. Whether or not you agree with any points I make, you're more than okay to share your opinions in the comments down below. So, after Volume 2, the pressure was on for the crew at Rooster Teeth to hit the ground running for its third outing, and really cement the series to the masses. With a long-awaited Vital Festival tournament and some debuts of previously teased characters, and more, the RWBY crew had a big challenge, regardless of the unfortunate passing of Montiome. Volume 3 might have started on a big, bumpy note, but was it able to accomplish its goals come its conclusion? Time to see if I feel it did or not. Let's kick off things with looking at the story. As I've mentioned in the past, one big negative that I had with the previous volume was come its end, even with some progress for some characters or plot points, the ending especially left me feeling like not enough changed in the scope of a volume. The villains were still on track, brushing off any bumps that they did have like it was nothing. Their major plans, targets, or reasonings weren't explored, and the heroes weren't any more aware themselves of their true foes. Volume 3, however, I can definitely say had change, and, thankfully, took what Volume 2 left behind to good use, leaving this volume feeling akin to The Empire Strikes Back or Book 2 of Avatar: The Last Airbender in its impacts and setup. Even with the overlay of the tournament, one aspect that I really liked was consequences being a factor. Events like the Veil Breach, the Atlas Army being present in Veil, and elements like Penny's true identity and the Grimm were used to benefit the villain's schemes, and show a level of consequences in this world through the ramifications that can follow. We then came out of this volume seeing the show isn't afraid to let the heroes come out of a volume as the losing side, though even then, Rooster Teeth was wise to show impacts to either side, with deaths, surprises, and power being gained. What many will remember this volume for will be that amazing darker tone that it impacted so perfectly into the show. But let's not ignore the familiar charming and energetic tones which actually worked off not too bad from the ending of Volume 2. The young heroes being at peace made for clear contrast to how they would end up at the end, and the much hyped Vital Festival tournament provided an effective stage for the shifts to come, on top of all of the new faces, and some of our heroes facing some personal tests beyond just some in-ring combat, as they start to truly grow. Thankfully, another big positive for me was the villains finally getting into the nitty-gritty of their schemes, seeing what exactly their targets were, and even glimpsing into their creation as a unit. There's no way that the RWBY crew could have gone into another volume without this exploration, though it did go through another patient start coinciding with Cinder and co maintaining their facade, and that did leave for a lot of their early scenes repeating the trend from before of being small bits of scheming in the same location, and Cinder not being as active as her allies. I think it had to be in this volume though, where the goals were reached, and the plan finally met its conclusion. Otherwise the pace and the eventual impact would have suffered for it in my opinion, if we had to wait one more volume. But we got more than enough, and now we know what they wanted to do. Gain the full maiden power, and cripple both Beacon and the united peace present amongst the kingdoms as a whole, aiding in Salem's goal it seems, of wounding humanity before making their suffering end with their demise. Seeing the bad guys finally pop out and try to accomplish their goals, and in doing so hitting the heroes and ourselves hard with all their tricks and the web of lies, was an explosion long overdue, and it now serves as the big turning point as we finally dive into what will be RWBY's major tale. Another big positive note that I don't see many mention by the way, is how solid the look into some new elements that were introduced was. The Schnee summoning semblance, the seasonal maidens, the silver-eyed warriors, They all got quickly showcased their possibilities, but still kept enough of itself wrapped up in mystery to save for the future, not rushing into exact information just yet. The moment that Winter brought up summoning, we saw its use and the steps to try and obtain such power, with only steady progress being Weiss's achievement in this area eventually by the end of the volume. The first chance to see what a seasonal maiden can do and how important they are, we saw one in action and showing off power unlike anything seen in the show before through Amber, as well as the large efforts that Cinder & Co took to try and forcibly claim that power. On the flip side, we had RWBY's Silver Eyes power show off first, before the quick discussion of its legacy and some of its meaning, but it did follow up on a long debated aspect from the very first episode, that of course being RWBY's Silver Eyes. It's great to see such levels of world building and exploration on Legends from way before the time of our heroes, as this in the end just helps the world feel more alive and not just contained to present day events. Super important right now since we're now looking to explore Remnant as a whole, and the villain's plans clearly don't affect just Beacon or Vale, but the whole world. If I did have one major issue other than this villain starting off slow again, it would be that maybe we could have done with the seasonal maidens thing being teased a little before its introduction, so it's not as quickly dropped on us as it was. Maybe the fairy tale being mentioned in the past, appearing here as a callback and then going into its exploration. That could have helped the ship feel a bit more smooth, but in the end what we got wasn't too bad. And if it's not the darker tones that will be remembered most in the story department this volume, it will be mostly the emotion that was explored. From the first episode to the last, the volume had that tense air about it, even with the antics of the tournament. For every exciting fight we got, we'd see at least one sign of the villains strengthening their schemes and some black clouds forming across many of our heroes. But that tension wasn't the only emotion on display. We saw different families have moments of bonding in their own ways. The adults with Crow's debut having the element of knowing all too well that they're running out of time. And we even had more tears than ever before in this series, with just as many cute and goofball nonsense as well. The RWBY crew know how emotion is important to these characters, especially to contrast how they would end up at the end, where Man Alive, the final half of the volume, and definitely the latter 3 or so episodes, was the most emotionally tense time in the show, and for a fan, that was insane to go through. Seeing this bright and passionate crowd of characters suddenly struck with a cruel scenario that capped off with a monster of an emotional conclusion was a real rush to witness, and thankfully it ended on enough of a sense of hope in the heroes to keep the spirits high. Gotta also mention the world of remnants for this volume, since they do provide notable info and teases that affect the plot. Now, as of this posting, we have had 4 more new topics. One on the Vital Festival Tournament, one on Huntsmen and Huntresses, one on the Cross-Continental Transmit System, and one on the Four Maidens Legend. Not counting any that might appear in, say, the home release, there's some decent topics that is explored there. And unlike Volume 2, I got less of a sense that information was repeated in the show itself, with maybe only the Four Maidens one being an exception, as that was more of an expansion of the previous telling of the story. I can see why the episode was released after its debut in the show, rather than before it, so the power wasn't a topic until its big reveal, but for the last World of Remnant, it did come with a lot of its contents being already public knowledge. That being said, I do appreciate that a lot of the narration was less clouded in mystique, and instead was more direct on what was being explained. Especially key on the risk of damaging the CCT could cause, or the elements like it's teasing the teams not lasting for whatever reason. Yes, keep the foreshadowing there, as it helps the drama form and grow, but if it's covered in too much mystery, it's hard to know what is information. With the expansion we're set to have on the world and possible story arcs, I do think we will see this side project return again, since we're going into a world that we know very little of. But with Ozpin being missing in action, whoever takes up the narrator role has to keep that clarity of information. I'll end this segment now with a bit of a big claim. The story was often touted as one of the weaker elements of past volumes, but for me, the story in Volume 3 was one of the biggest highlights, maybe even at the top of that list. for such an improvement and for how well they managed to pull off many of the emotions and themes, some of them uncommon to the show, just as well as the familiar and friendly sort, means the praise for this section will be well deserved. This truly did feel like the right volume to end the prologue, if you will, of this massive story that's set to span out. Check out part 2 when next up I go over how I feel volume 3 used the characters.